Bi-weekly SPM practitioner group meeting. Can everyone hear me okay? See any comments here? Okay, my name is Mark Coleman. I'm managing partner with Compensation Analytics. And this week we are going to be discussing a topic that's important to all practitioners, and that is how to simplify compensation operations. Not only will we discuss simplification, but we're going to also cover 5 other improvement techniques that can be used. Hassan Mahmood is with us today, and he's going to be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions or would like to add some comments for emphasis, feel free to use the chat window. And before we get into it, I'd like to spend 60 seconds just describing the goals of the practitioner group to some of the people who are joining us for the first time today. Okay. So this is, I think, our second meeting, and the goal of the group is to help members connect with their peer group, to give each other good ideas, share successes, as well as share lessons learned. You know, try this, don't try that. Our desire is to have this be a member-led organization. We're priming the pump, but we're looking for volunteers to share their experiences and challenges so you don't get sick of hearing from us all the time. We are also putting some finishing touches on a website that will allow you to review all of the recorded sessions as well as download the presentations and continue discussions and comment boxes beneath each of the topics. We'll have instructions on how to reach that website at the end of this presentation. So our group is growing. We've got about 24 companies represented so far. And in addition to a diverse set of industries and distribution models, the group is also comprised of members from design, operations, and technology. So it's a really good group. We're going to be rotating topics between kind of business-focused topics and technology-focused topics to cover as many of the group's interests as possible. So let's take a look at today's agenda here. So we're going to start out by talking about the evolution of process, the process that we all use every day. Where did they come from? And then we're going to go through the 10 steps to process improvement. And we're going to work a case study along the way as we go through that. We're going to try a discussion. I'm going to try using the poll feature here of GoToWebinar. And then we'll wrap up and talk about upcoming topics and how to get to the website so you can download these presentations if you would like to. So let's talk about how do things become so complex. I think where I see it occurring the most is when companies have grown rapidly or merged, they often have a lot of difficulty paying their sales forces accurately. And they also struggle to produce good reports. I think mergers are especially challenging as the plans, processes, and technologies collide in an environment where there's really a sense of urgency to get through the merger as quickly as possible. So what typically happens is there's pressure to get the pay right, firefighting teams respond, quickly deploying ad hoc processes, and so forth. But what happens over time is that these solutions become fragile, and as you demand more and more from them, their ad hoc nature leads to their breakdown. I've worked with companies where it's not uncommon to be dealing with merger-related issues 5 or more years post the merger, and I'm sure many of you have seen the same thing. Now let's take a look at what are some of the, what are some of the symptoms of possible process problems. You may have a process problem if your sales reps are complaining about your process. That sounds obvious, but if you're hearing things like it takes so much work just to get paid here, or I have no idea how my pay is arrived at, there's probably some underlying processes that are contributing to that, right? If your department makes numerous errors or makes the same ones over and over again, that's probably a good indication. If you're seeing service requests, phone calls, emails from the field, spiking after every payroll with the same sorts of mistakes, draw count errors, roll-up credits not getting rolled up, the wrong attainment numbers used in bonus calculations, things like that. There's probably some underlying process issues that are making that happen. And then tenure is another thing. If the average tenure of people in your group exceeds 10 years, that can mean entrenchment of the status quo. And it makes it a bit more challenging to change the way things are because people are just so used to doing their jobs the way they've been doing it. So I love this quote here. It's, we're too busy mopping the floor to turn off the faucet. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So in the realm of process improvement, there's a lot of different terms thrown out, right? There's Six Sigma, there's BPR, there's quality management, and I wanted to differentiate between two major types before we go too much further. And they are, the first one, re-engineering. So when people say re-engineering, they're typically saying, you know, we're designing the future state. We want to stay focused on the future. We're not overly concerned about the current world because our future processes are going to be driven by our new technology. I think a good examples of where this work is where you're using a very standardized process. So if you're putting in a new accounting package in, it's very mature technology, very standardized process. If you're doing a greenfield operation and you can do a clean slate, those are also great re-engineering opportunities. The second is process improvement, and that's what we're going to be talking about here today. And that starts with a solid understanding of the current process. It works best in areas where the processes are not standardized and are complex. And it begins with understanding, challenging and improving, maybe throwing out some pieces even. And then once you've got a good solution, then you automate that. So a good example of that would be Lean Six Sigma. And in my experience, the whole compensation field is rarely clean slate. You know, you've got to work with a lot of existing pieces. So let's start looking at how we go about doing this. So the 10 steps of process improvement, and we're going to look at the case study embedded as we go through there. So, you know, the first step is to determine the scope and the scope boundaries of the process improvement effort. You know, without a clear scope definition, scope creep could make this one of the projects that never ends. So it's really important up front that you're clear on what you're trying to achieve and which processes specifically you're going to be looking at. And this is where some fairly simple frameworks can help people get their heads around where the boundaries exist. And one that we use, and I'm not a methodology zealot or anything, this just one happens to work, any one can work, just uses 6 core processes, and it's cyclical. So it begins with comp design, administration of the rules, products, hierarchies, rates, all that good stuff, actually processing comp, communicating through statements and reports, providing service, so answering questions, dispute resolution, things like that, analyzing plan effectiveness, and then plan effectiveness feeds into the next design cycle. So this is just a tool, and then for each one of these 6, we decompose them into 3 to 5 blocks or sub-processes. Okay? And these are generic that we're going to go through. I'm not going to definitely go through all 24 of these, but they have to be fine-tuned for your organization, and that typically is not a big exercise. So if we look at design, in this example, it decomposes to 5 different pieces. From reviewing the strategy and the allowables, how much is the product group going to give us to go towards incentives, applying those to different jobs, financial modeling, and then actually communicating the plans. To administration, managing our participants, our sales hierarchies, our products, our territories, our components and measures, all that good stuff. To actually processing the pay, collecting and validating through accounting and paying it. Communicating, pay statements, field reports, management reports. Service, like I talked about before, making sure we've got a method to track, categorize, classify all the different service requests are coming in, learn from that, making sure that we're meeting our service levels, and providing self-service options as well. And then finally, analyze. Make sure that we're tracking and forecasting our total payouts so we don't have multi-million-dollar surprises at the end of the quarter. If we tried something new, was it effective? Did we get the revenue lift that we thought we were going to get? And so forth. So that when you've got these 24 processes here roughly, level 2 processes, the trick is to figure out where do you want to do the deep dive? You know, which of these processes, if you were to go through an improvement effort, is going to yield some improvement results. Let's talk about that next step. And that's really all about asking questions. So how many people does this process impact? Does it impact 5 people in a special role, or does it impact the entire field organization? Who is the customer? Is it the CEO, or is it people perhaps in lower levels? How big a deal is it to fix it? Is this going to be like an SAP implementation, or is this something that we can do in terms of months within existing budgets without having to go ask for a ton of money? How frequently is the process used? Is it something we do every day or twice a year? If we do it every day and it's broken and we fix it, then we're going to get a lot of benefits. If we only do it twice a year and we fix it, obviously the benefits aren't going to be as great. What are the current satisfaction levels? Are people happy with it? What's the pain associated with actually producing the results? Is it a loosely defined or heavily entrenched process? If it's a very ad hoc process, once you figure out what's going on, designing a new process probably isn't too challenging. If it's heavily entrenched, you can have more work on the change management side. And then finally, just to summarize it all, is the cost benefit there for the organization if you were to fix that specific process. So let's walk through an example here. This is where our case study begins. This is a organization that says, well, let's take a high-level look across everything from financial modeling through to the end of service. And let's figure out where there would be some benefits of process improvement. So those categories that we just talked about, number of people affected, who our client is this a quick fix, is it going to be very expensive, all those sorts of things are across the top here. And then we just have a simple score to help us track and classify whether this is going to be a big winner or a small winner. Then we can go through the fun exercise of filling it all out, and we'll get something that looks like this. And you can see in this example that communicate plan, it affects everybody. It's affecting the senior management because they're getting complaints from the field that the field's not getting their goal sheets until the half is over. In this particular example, this company produces quota territory goal sheets for thousands of people every 6 months. And the pain here is that at the end of the 6 months, only about 60% of the field actually receive their goals, which you can imagine in incentive management is a non-ideal situation. When we conducted some of the interviews, we even heard some unintended consequences, people saying things like, my boss told me my quota is going to be $2 million, but I haven't got into writing yet, and I've got this big deal in the pipeline, and I'm afraid that if this big deal goes through, that my quota is going to go up. So you get unintended consequences of people, sandbagging and slowing things down until they get their quota sheets. So this was a big deal for this company. They do it twice a year, but because they were doing it pretty much all the time, it scored a bit higher on the timing. And it came through at a 23.5, our highest score on here. So we're going to continue with this example as we go through the 10 steps. So that numerical approach is great if you love Excel and numbers. Here's a couple other ways you can look at that. Heat maps and dependency grids can also be helpful in communicating priorities. So there's this heat map on the left is basically showing pain, going out to all the different aspects of the field, asking them where their pain is, and that being a rocket science test, you can see that we have a statement problem with this particular company. And then I like the 2x2 grid on the right, because what this also shows is the dependencies. So if we have, process number 2.5 is broken, but 2.5, the solution components of that are dependencies for 5 other processes, that's going to get a bigger circle. So the best case scenario here would be something that's going to be fairly easy to implement, adds lots of value, and is a big circle because it's going to put components in that are going to make other things easier. So let's take a look at the next step in the 10-step process. Next group of steps here. So now that we've focused in on communicate, we're going to start drawing process maps, make sure we really understand what's going on and why it's such a big deal. Estimate times and costs, and then we're going to verify the process map to make sure that we've got it right. So I think everyone's pretty familiar with flow charting. Just a real quick review here. It has a start and an end. In this example, we start with the financial plan coming out of the CFO's office. They all have inputs and outputs, action-oriented verb-type process names, not the ability to. It's going to be, process X or calculate this or verify. You can do it as a simple flow chart, or you could do it as a swim lane. I think people have a tougher time getting their heads around swim lanes, but if you have a lot of handoffs across multiple departments, swim lanes is probably the best way to show that. We're also going to show which tools are used, and if something's not super clear, you can always annotate the flow chart to give some examples to help people understand it quickly. So let's go through a real-life example. So when I produce these things, I'm a very hands-on guy. I like to use these big, colorful Post-its that can be picked up, moved around easily, written on with the large letters so everybody can read it, and kind of use this as our first draft version. So this is actually denoting department. So finance is this purpley color. Sales operations is green. Field management is yellow. And then the commissions department is orange. And you can see there's a lot going on to create these goal sheets here. And I think the most interesting stuff is I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but there's a lot of churn going on between sales ops and commission accounting. You think, well, why is that? So next step is to clean this up and begin validating the process. And I think validating is important for two reasons. The most obvious one is you want to make sure it's accurate. The second one is that you don't want the process to be challenged when you're presenting it to sponsors. If in the first 5 minutes of your presentation someone pipes up and says that's wrong, that's really going to deflate anything else that you have to say. So it's really important to make sure that you've got this right before you take it to the sponsors. Not speaking from any personal experience, of course. So next thing we show is where's the churn going on, and then we layer in what's the different technologies being used. So you can see this, we've got a pretty Excel-happy organization here, a bit of Excel and Access. What this doesn't show is the number of versions of Excel going on. We'll get to that a little bit later. So the next step is to assign times and costs to this to understand what's really going on here. And when we look at time, we think of two different parts. Processing time. When you're actually working on it, how long does it take for the process to convert the inputs to the outputs? And then duration. This includes the queue time and delay. So a good example would be, for a manager to approve a form. Actually approving the form may take 3 to 5 minutes, but if it sits in his or her inbox for 6 days, the duration is going to be 6 days. And this is done at the lower level processes. Costs, they can get pretty complicated, and you need to follow the norms of the organization that you work with. Some only want to see direct costs incurred by the department, and I've worked with others that want to estimate how much air conditioning you're going to use on the weekends for overtime. So that can be all over the map. Once you've got the costs and you know the number of processes, you can assign cost per transactions. You can get a cost per transaction, and that can be, when you're comparing different processes, that can be very enlightening. Let's take a look at a simplified example. These are all the processes down the left here from simplified process flow, not the big Post-it one. And here we have our cycle time, how long does it take to do it, and then the duration, how long does it actually take to do it beginning to end. And you can see we've got in red some problem hotspots. Getting geographic region VP approval, so the Asia Pac, EMEA, Americas. Altogether, it only takes them about a day to do it. Duration is much longer than that, obviously. We'll talk about that a bit as well. We get to the next step. Okay. Let's talk about the 6 improvement techniques. Number 1, is there bureaucracy? What's bureaucracy? Well, do we have complex forms? Do we have multiple levels of approvals? Think the IRS. That's the 10-page form that has to get through 10 people. Value add. This process add value to our end customer. Let me hit the button here. Apologize. To our end customer, just our business unit, or does it add value to anybody? You've got to ask that question. Duplication. Is this something that we do once or we do 10 times? A common example I often see is the Excel extract people use to, 10 different reports that are 90% identical across all the different sales offices. Can the process be simplified? Do we really need a form? If a form is required, can it be 3 questions rather than 5 pages? Things like that. If approvals are required, can we just get 1 rather than 3? Things like that. Can the cycle time be reduced? Is there a way we can batch these processes up together? Is there a way we can shorten the queue times, and so forth? And then finally, once we've decided if it adds value, it's not duplicative, and it's been simplified, how can we get the computer to do it better and faster for us? Let's take a look at some of the improvement opportunities in our example. Did we see any bureaucracy? Well, we did. We saw commission analysts were improving directors and sales operations instructions. We also saw some excessive QA that was holding up the entire process. Is it a required process? Well, communicating targets is very important. That was definitely required. There was excessive zero-value cut and paste activities with all those Excel spreadsheets that were flying around. Duplication. Data was being entered multiple times. Every iteration was being entered onto a tracking spreadsheet that tracked versions. And for the Americas alone, there was 75 versions of the spreadsheet. Can it be simplified? Well, better tools, the data could be centralized and processing would be much more straight through. We could also eliminate the bureaucracy around the commission analysts approving the director's instructions. Could cycle times be reduced? The challenge there was getting cutoff enforcement. Everyone say this is the due date, but then 95% of the time the date would slip. So solid enforcement of those dates and batching up of changes could reduce the processing time significantly. And then finally, when we look at automation, some of the distribution and tracking tools were cumbersome, requiring a fix. We had to get that fixed. And if everyone used the common format spreadsheet, that would make loading all of these things a lot easier. So, without a lot of work, you can find a lot of significant improvements here. So now that we understand our processes, costs, and identify the improvement opportunities, what's next? That is, we have to look at, do we need internal controls, or do we need to, and then we need to test and rework the processes. So if we had removed processes, if, for example, taking out the commission analyst QA of the sales ops director's instructions, what's the worst that could happen? Well, we could have quotas that didn't add up to the global targets, which would be bad. We also had scenarios where TBH stands for to be hired. So people that hadn't been hired yet, blank slots were carrying a lot of quota, maybe more than the real people were. So we had to get that balance loaded. And then rework and delays when the quotas do not match the job role. So if your job, you don't sell service contracts, but you have a quota for service contracts, that's going to be a problem. So then once we know where some of the QA issues could pop up, what are some non-bureaucratic controls that could be put in place so that we can sleep at night? So we could put some audit reports in, right, so that we QA the goal sheets before sales ops sends them to commissions. So we're checking to make sure that we've got quotas that match our plan, and that our TBHs aren't carrying too much of the quota assignments, and then our quotas all add up. That's not overly difficult to do. We could also put a checklist in place to make sure that before it was sent to commissions for administration, that a number of the common things they look at have been looked after. So piloting, in this particular case, for the next half, the team is going to be testing new rules of engagement, specifically around date enforcement, moving to one format across all regions around the world, batching up the changes, and no analyst QA. The term that's being used is load and go. And then In the following half, a centralized database is going to be used to streamline all of that movement of data for every single participant. So here's a high-level picture of what that solution looks like. Basically, the big lesson here is that let's not start allocating quotas out until we've got some solid numbers. If finance changes the numbers on us or doesn't give us hardware and service together, we can't really get started. And make sure that we've got a sales hierarchy that reflects what the organization is going to look like in the new half, so that we allocate it to people who are going to be in those jobs at that time. So that whole bunch of processes here on the left to make sure that is all looked after. And then the centralized database here in the bottom right, being loaded with that new hierarchy, and then those new reports back to sales ops and the modeling tools to make sure that the quotas add up. And then syncing. This particular client uses a product called TrueComp from Callidus and Plan Communicator. Plan Communicator wasn't synced with TrueComp, so you had to teach Plan Communicator all of your plans. There's a way to sync them, and you can save that whole step, so that step goes away. So the final step is then rollout, training, and communication, which is, it's standard stuff. We've worked out all the bugs, we've designed a solution, basically put the technology pieces in place, test it, roll it out, communicate it to everybody. Okay, excuse me a second here. Okay, so if we look at the whole thing from end to end here, we reviewed process performance at a high level to identify areas where the improvements are going to be noticed by your customer. You don't want to be working on a ton of stuff, and at the end of the day, no one cares. Once we figured out where we could make a difference, we dug into those processes to really understand what was going on, noted the root causes, and then validated that we had the process right. We assembled and documented our time and cost statistics, and then we went through the 6 improvement steps, challenging everything. And I guess the important thing here is that you're viewed as critiquing the process and not the process owners, because there can be a lot of sensitivity at this step. And the things we're looking at are, do we need to do it? Does it add value? If we need to do it, can we simplify it? Can we eliminate redundancies so we don't have 10 people doing the same thing? And then what's left, can we have computers automate it and make it work better for us? We test it, work out the bugs, and then we implement it and keep improving it. And then the trick here is to make sure that the bureaucracy, duplication, and complexity doesn't creep back in. So, when I look at something like this, I think this sounds like common sense. This shouldn't be a big deal. Why doesn't everybody do this? So I think there's a number of challenges out there. I think a number of organizations skim the solution design phase, and they focus their efforts primarily on the technology implementation. And in those scenarios, the requirements equals the current process, which basically means you're doing a migration project. You're migrating the calculator or whatever it is from the old to the new, and everything else is going to stay the same. And in my experience, most of the challenges are not with the technology, they're with bad policies, bureaucracy, all the things that we've talked about. Not that technology isn't a problem, but solutions that take into account all the things that we've talked about and technology are incredibly powerful. Taking on too big of a scope, it's going to stretch finite resources. They're going to be bumping into each other because of how these processes interact with each other.